Hey, my name is Anton. Guys, sit and hold tightly to your chair because what I'm about to tell you is a really mind-blowing story. Try to imagine you're flying a plane, a big commercial aircraft from Tallinn, Estonia to Moscow, Russia. But as soon as you take off, you realize that your front gear won't go up. What is even worse, it won't go down too, and it's stuck right in between. You try to get back to the airport you have just took off from, but the air traffic control tells you that it has become too foggy and the emergency services couldn't manage the situation properly. And trying to return and land will make it even more dangerous. Which it is, because if you try to land, the plane will just nosedive right into the Soviet concrete. And considering the hardness of the metal they used to unload us,
it's amazingly tough.
You can imagine how hard the concrete was. So you fly to the nearest other big airport, Шоссейная, now Pulkovo, in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, at very low altitudes and as slowly as a jet plane can possibly fly, while trying to fix the gear right in the air with a stick from the wardrobe through a hole in the cockpit. Couldn't be any worse, right? Well, imagine that all of your attempts to fix the gear are unsuccessful, and while cruising above the city center at 600 meters, it's less than 2,000 feet, you lose both of your engines. The only place to land is the Neva River, which comparing to the Hudson River, where Captain Sullenberger will ditch his Airbus A320 half a century later, is this wide and this long. The story is so unique, but so forgotten that it really seems fictional, but it is real. So real that we will visit the very place where it happened. Also, I found and translated for you a TV program with literal co-pilot and flight attendant, and also people who communicated with them from the ground and made decisions.
We will also look at some witness testimonies and get ready for a plot twist at the end.
There is almost no deep information about this in English, so I am the guy to tell you this. Anyway, make yourself some tea and sandwiches because it's gonna be interesting. Let's go. Our story begins in Tallinn, Estonia, USSR, the 21st of August 1963. A plane Tu-124 is preparing to take off and head to Vnukovo, Moscow. The plane itself in the story is pretty important, so let me tell you a little bit about it. Tu-124 was a Soviet narrow-body jet airliner, one of the first in the world to use the bypass turbofan engines, by the way. And just like everything is Soviet, it wasn't made from scratch, it was made from something else. So the Tu-124 was originally developed as a smaller version of Tu-104, which originally was developed as a civil version of a military bomber Tu-16. Remember this, it's going to be crucial. And by the way, it's not TU but Tu because it stands for Tupolev, the last name of the engineer who ruled the firm. So this was a normal flight. The passengers were told to fasten their seatbelts, do not smoke until the plane reached a certain altitude, and they took off. It was very normal until just 18 seconds later, when the green light of the front gear down position didn't turn off. Worse than that, the red light didn't turn off too. The red light, which stands for gear operating in progress. The pilot Viktor Mostovoy and co-pilot Vasily Chechenev looked at each other, slowly realizing how big of a problem that was, and began the procedure for declaring an emergency. What happened was that the front landing gear, instead of being pulled up by the lifting mechanism and then being locked in the upper position, separated from the lifting mechanism right in between
and swung down.
But the locks were already closed, so it just hit the bottom lock's outside part with a loud metal crank and got stuck in between, swinging up and down by the wind. As I've already said, the pilots declared an emergency and were expecting to be sent back to Tallinn, but they weren't because of foggy weather, and instead they were told that it is safer to fly to the airport of Leningrad, Шоссейная, which had good weather and a decently long runway. The surprises didn't end there, however. So what's the plan? The liner had basically no front gear. So how would it land? You will be surprised, but the captain was advised to land the plane as it is, without the front gear. Yeah, it seems like an interesting way to say, you'll probably die, but you can try. It actually wasn't. Why? Well, luckily, we have an opportunity to listen to the participants, because I found a tape of an old TV program from 1999 where they had a chance to discuss this incident 36 years later. I've decided to leave their original voices and write subtitles. This is very exclusive because this gentleman is Vasily Chechenev himself, who landed the plane. This is Alexandra Alexandrova, flight attendant, and this is Ivan Mulkidjanov, a civil aviation expert who was called to the Moscow Vnukovo Tower to deal with the situation remotely. And finally, this is Vladislav Kochetov, who was responsible for the operation of the airport in Leningrad, where they were supposed to land after the emergency occurred. Let's listen to Mr. Mulkidjanov on why they told the pilots to try to land the plane without the front gear.
Я сказал, готовьтесь к нормальной посадке, и я уверен, что вы благополучно сядете.
Простите, а в чем, так сказать, заключается эта посадка-то?
Потому что самолет садится в первую очередь на основные ноги,
Да.
бежит, и пока есть аэродинамически достаточные силы, он продолжает бежать. Потом, по мере падения скорости, самолет начинает опускать нос, уже касается бетона. Заканчивалось это незначительными повреждениями передней носовой части самолета. И поэтому было предложено и для осуществления аварийной вынужденной посадки запасной Ленинград, который был рядом.
So the pilots flew to Leningrad, while the rest of the crew were busy carrying the boxes with mail and food that they were carrying to the tail of the plane to make the front end lighter. It was just a 300 kilometers flight to Leningrad, so soon they were there.
And here's what one of the crew members of the airport Chasene in Leningrad said.
Была подготовлена основная полоса, то есть расставлены пожарные машины, санитарные машины. Опыт большой был посадок без передней ноги. Не грозило даже самолеты, которые садятся с убранной передней ногой, как правило, восстанавливаются в течение месяца и продолжают полеты.
I'm pretty sure that they were scared of landing without the front gear. Very, very much. I mean, who wouldn't? I'm still scared to press my bicycle's front brake too hard not to flip over. While they literally had a plane and they would have been moving at 150 kilometers an hour when touching the ground, at least. So I assume they decided to try to avoid it at any cost, and tried to do that while dumping fuel above Leningrad's countryside.
Oops, I made a mistake. Kind of. See, in 1963, according to the aviation regulations of the USSR, such an emergency landing could only be made with a small amount of fuel in the tanks, no more than 1 ton. However, they could not dump fuel because they were above the center of a huge city. Therefore, they had to circle over Leningrad until they used all of the extra fuel.
Here I must tell you a bit more about Soviet people.
The decisions they make are pretty hardcore sometimes. Let me give you an example.
A few years before that, in a similar situations on Tu-124, the co-pilot tied one of the crew members with a rope and lowered him into the open landing gear hatch while flying, so that he could put a screwdriver on the place of a broken bolt and fix the gear. And it worked. So the idea to break one of the hangers in the aircraft wardrobe in order to use the wooden crossbar from it to push the landing gear down and secure it in that position doesn't seem that crazy anymore. For real, those meanwhile in Russia memes are partly true, as you can tell. But the problem was how to get to the gear. Tu-124 is no Tu-16, it is a civil aircraft with no technical holes in it. Remember I told you it was based on a bomber? Yes, unlike literally any other civil aircraft, Tu-124 still had a small glass compartment at the bottom of the cockpit. Previously it was used for aiming, but no longer needed in a civil aircraft and remained as a legacy of the Tu-16. I paid for the whole plane, I'm gonna use the whole plane, probably screamed the flight engineer while breaking the glass floor of that compartment to get access to the gear.
It's a whole different story of how they tried to fix the landing gear while flying, and we'll partly cover it later, but for now I'd just like to mention that it had been happening for at least 2 hours and at least 16 rounds above St. Petersburg.
When they finally decided to go on their last lap and land on the main gear only, giving up the idea to land normally. As we can tell now, they will soon push their standards of normal landing even further. So they were doing their last lap when right above the city center, near the St. Isaac's Cathedral and the Palace Square, on the altitude of 400 meters, about 1,300 feet, they lost their left and 3 seconds later, their right engine. As you can tell, when they declared these failures, people on the other end of the radio said just the dry copy that. Just 14 seconds later, the plane will disappear from the radars. Seemed like they had no chances. However, let's move back to the cockpit. The co-pilot, Mr. Chechenyev, was not just any pilot, but a former military one, like any Soviet pilot. More than that, he flew a hydroplane. So, realizing that there's almost no chance to survive this, keeping in mind that at that time there has never ever been registered a successful water ditching of a plane that big without casualties, he said, "Only Neva can save us. Let me take the yoke." "Take it, try," said the captain and let Chechenyev do the rest. Well, probably praying he succeeds.
Ничего уже не сделаешь. Только что вот оставалась Нева, да и единственное, что мы использовали.
Now I think I need to show you what happened next on the very same place.
Let's go to the outskirts of St. Petersburg, to the Nevsky district.
So, Here's the place. Can you see that bridge in the distance? It's the Alexander Nevsky Bridge. At 12:15 p.m., the crew flew over that bridge at the altitude of just about 15 meters. But wait a minute, the height of the bridge itself is 11 meters, yeah, but street lights on the top are another 5 that should have crashed. But at this moment, a series of very lucky coincidences began.
In March 1962, this bridge was almost finished, but still didn't have the streetlights installed in this, and this sections. And that is where the crew is believed to have flown over the bridge just 4 meters above the concrete span. However, it was too early to relax, because right on the other side of the bridge they saw a boat. That day, young Captain Yuri Porshun was driving a loaded barge upstream of the Neva at the helm of a small tug BP-10. What a beautiful name that is. When he heard a strange noise and then saw a jet plane flying just a few meters above his ship, he didn't think for a long time, instantly unhooking pontoons that he was carrying, turning the ship around, and going to the plane as quickly as possible to help.
Let's return to the plane itself. After flying over the tug, their biggest and most dangerous problem finally drew their attention. The Finlandsky Railroad Bridge, just 1 kilometer or about 3,000 feet away. Crazy small distance for a plane to land. But there was one very happy coincidence. Their gear was down, as you probably remember. But this time, it was a good thing. When Tu-124 touched the water with its lower gear, it created some drag to help slow the plane down. So when it finally touched the water, none of the passengers were even injured. The plane safely landed on water and stopped just about 25 meters, it's about 80 feet, from the next bridge, which is also an insane amount of luck they had that day. The front landing gear, after touching the water, was turned off, hit the fuselage, creating a big hole. Finally, it wasn't stuck, but the hole in the plane was quite a problem because the plane began to sink. Sink. The plane began to sink. And as you maybe remember, the plane had another gaping hole underneath, which was created by the crew themselves in attempts to fix the gear. Luckily, at this moment, Yuri Porshun had arrived.
Ну, наша реакция мгновенная, сразу отдаем буксиры, подходим к самолету.
So both him and the plane's crew had to do something. The pilot, who probably got used to making holes in his own plane at the time, broke the windshield and took the rope from the tug and tied it to the yokes.
Подхожу кормой уже к носу самолета, они разбивают лобовое стекло, подают трос, и выхожу на буксире и начинаю буксировать.
Потрясающе, вы как будто каждый день этим занимаетесь.
Ну, у меня работа такая, буксировка.
Вот такая у меня.
Вот.
The tug driver needed to decide where to park the plane. And then he noticed that the right wing was broken and bent upwards. So he managed to park the plane on his own pontoons that he was carrying before. The way that the wing lied on them like a ladder. So all the passengers just literally walked out of the plane. So when the tug driver was told that everyone is okay and fine and alive, he needed to put the plane somewhere. And he decided to tug it back to that bridge because he thought that it's shallow there. He was mistaken, it was about 5 meters deep. Anyway, at that time, the emergency services had arrived, so they tried to pump out the water of the plane. It didn't work out. The holes were too big thanks to the crew. So they decided to finally let the plane sink. The next morning, it was lifted from the bottom of the river by a crane, and literally half of the city was there to witness it with their own eyes. However, it also wasn't the end of the story, because shortly after the landing, the pilots were accused
of doing something which presumably led to the situation in the first place.
Let's get back to the studio. What I'm about to tell you next is debatable and based on my opinion. But I've searched through dozens of eyewitnesses' testimonies and public documents. This is argued by even the pilots themselves. Do you remember why the engine stopped? No? No wonder, I haven't told you. The thing is that the examination discovered that the engine stopped not from a technical issue, but from the lack of fuel.
Ну, вот как комиссия считала, в процессе полетов по выработке топлива и одновременно попытки членов экипажа зафиксировать переднюю ногу в переднем выпущенном положении, был упущен контроль за выработкой топлива. А дальше блестящая реализация посадки.
Да, причины основные эти были. Экипаж действовал правильно, согласно руководству полетной эксплуатации. Но вот эта увлеченность их, попытка дожать, видимо, ногу, и ослабила контроль за расходом топлива.
Но как может быть ослаблен контроль, когда загорелась красная лампочка?
Да.
Значит, мы нормально летали. Если бы мы топливо-то было.
Obviously, all decisions on how many laps should they take to dump the fuel were on Captain Mostovoy. So the whole situation could have been avoided and they could have just landed in the airport. Все, кроме них, говорят, что топливо кончилось. И экспертиза подтвердила, что топливо кончилось. So the Special Aviation Commission had to decide on the pilot's fate, whether they would consider that the initial landing gear problem was the cause of the incident, or pilot's actions of simply dumping out all the last bits of fuel. They made the first decision. The pilots didn't go to the court and didn't lose their licenses. However, it meant that they were heroes. Here's what the participants said.
Была дилемма. С одной стороны, награждать нельзя, наказывать тоже ни рука, ни совесть. Но потом начались, по-моему, реорганизации. Закончился без наград для экипажа.
And what about the photos? The magazines, the newspapers, half of the city was there to see it with their own eyes. Well, it's typical USSR. The police came up to people and exposed the film in their cameras just because.
Я снял полностью пленку. Эта пленка тоже у меня была изъята.
Just because it was the Soviet Union. And the newspapers were also forbidden to write about this incident until the party decided whether it was appropriate or not. So only after a few months they could finally tell this story. And at that time the trend had already passed and everyone had told each other. So the Soviet Hudson was forgotten.
Привет, it's Anton's Russian Mafia cousin speaking. If you don't subscribe to this channel, you'll regret it.